All right, we're going to take a moment and let people enter our Zoom room. If you are here for the webinar on the IHRA definition of the fight against anti-Semitism, you are in the right place. Just bear with us. We're going to take a few minutes, a few moments to let people join the webinar before we get started. But thanks for your patience. All right, it's 12:01. I think we're going to get started. There are still some people filing into our Zoom webinar room, but we'll go ahead and get started. So good morning and welcome everybody. I am Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm very happy to welcome you to our webinar today, which is part 5 in a series we're hosting on the IHRA definition and the fight against anti-Semitism. Today's webinar focuses on opportunities and struggles for progressive Jews as relates to the IHRA struggle and anti-Semitism. So as some background, the IHRA definition, we call it IHRA like it's a friend or an uncle. It's actually the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which when people use that term, they generally mean to include its examples, which many of which relate to Israel, is on its way to being adopted and used across the globe, where it poses a serious threat to free speech, from the State Department to English premier soccer teams, from universities to social media platforms. There are concerted efforts ongoing to label criticism of Israeli policies and challenges to Zionism as anti-Semitism, and to impose formal and even legal consequences. And these efforts are gaining momentum. In parallel, over the past few months, we have seen disagreements over the IHRA definition that are coming out among organizations representing Jewish Americans. They've surfaced in Jewish media outlets and sometimes on a weekly and even on a daily basis. Groups that have long been more conservative in terms of their views on resisting criticism of Israel, criticism of Israeli policies, have publicly urged the Biden administration to adopt the IHRA definition, while organizations that are generally more liberal in their views of criticizing Israel and the correctness of doing so have increasingly voiced their opposition to the definition, largely based on concerns about free speech. And this battle is taking place against the backdrop of a petition campaign. I think we're going to put a note about this into the chat box, led by Jewish Voice for Peace and supported by dozens of other organizations, including several of the foundation's grantees, urging Facebook to resist pressure to use the label of anti-Semitism as a pretext to silence critics of Israel. And that petition is closing in on, I think, 50,000 signers or so. So we chose to have this webinar with only Jewish panelists, as people will notice. We are having another one next week that will only have Palestinian panelists. The focus today, we want to talk specifically about what this effort to redefine anti-Semitism, quash criticism of Israel means in and for Jews and Jewish communities. So our 3 panelists bring experience and expertise that highlight different facets of this struggle. And I'm going to introduce our panelists quickly here in alphabetical order. You can read their full bios on our website, www.fmep.org. So first we have Corey Balsam, who is the National Coordinator of Independent Jewish Voices Canada, and is among the leaders of their campaign, which is called No IHRA. Very clear title. And he is coming to us from Ottawa today. Second, we have Rebecca Pierce, who is a writer and filmmaker based in San Francisco. And her multimedia storytelling covers a diverse range of topics, including race, religion, global conflict, and human rights. And I will add, she is, I would argue, one of the most important people you could be following on Twitter today if you want to understand the intersection between the issues around Israel and race and US politics and culture, and I learn from her every single day. And third, we have Barry Trachtenberg, who teaches Jewish history at Wake Forest University and is the author most recently of The Revolutionary Roots of Modern Yiddish, 1903 to 1917, and the United States in the Nazi Holocaust, Race, Refuge, and Remembrance. I became aware of Barry and one of his fans after following his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee back in 2017 on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which marked one of the earliest efforts to codify the IHRA definition into law. So before we get started, some quick housekeeping. As is the normal FMEP webinar practice, the format today is going to be a moderated Q&A conversation between myself and the panelists. In addition to my own questions, we are eager to take your questions. Please put them in the Q&A box in the webinar panel. You will see that at the bottom of your Zoom window. Do not put them in the chat box. I won't see them. And if you raise your hand, I won't see that either because we're not using the raised hand thing. I don't know why they added it back. We can't get rid of it, and it's just confusing to everyone. So use the Q&A box. The chat box is if you have admin questions, and we will be other colleagues will be watching that. I'll also note the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook for your future viewing pleasure. So with that, let's get started. I want to go a first round, which I am calling setting the scene. So in many webinars and podcasts and many articles, and that's myself, my colleagues, people I work with, we've all been discussing the major problems in the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and its examples and the ways it's being used to delegitimize, quash, and chill criticism of Israel and advocacy for Palestinian rights. So please check things we've written, check the webinars we've done before to see more about that. Today, we're going to focus with our panelists on the impact the efforts to redefine anti-Semitism, including through the IHRA definition, but not exclusively, are having in and on Jewish communities. So I'm going to start with Corey. Corey, our neighbor to the north, Canada, which we so often forget about. But I don't because I know that you're there and it gives me hope. So let's start with you. Tell us about the situation in Canada vis-a-vis efforts to redefine anti-Semitism, and specifically talk about what the Jewish communities there are doing in terms of pushing back. And can you also speak about relationships with governmental authorities and how you are navigating that?
Great, thank you, Lara, and everyone at FMEP for hosting this and for including Canada as part of the conversation. So it may be surprising for some of our viewers today, given Canada's generally friendly and liberal image on the international scene, but when it comes to Israel-Palestine, both the Canadian Jewish community and the Canadian government are both quite right-wing, conservative, pro-Israel. You may know that Canada even votes with the tiny pro-Israel bloc at the UN systematically, which includes the US, Canada, Israel, and a few islands in the South Pacific when it comes to Palestinian rights issues at the UN. So part of this is on account of Canada's own self-interest, but a big part is also, like in the US, Canada has a very strong pro-Israel lobby, and actually adding to its clout these days, the main pro-Israel lobby group, CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, is the lobbying arm of the Jewish federations in Canada. So they cover lobbying for the Jewish community and for Israel. So it was actually CIJA in the fall of 2018 that announced that they were launching a campaign to have the IHRA definition adopted at all levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal, as well as by universities, et cetera, saying explicitly that the reason they were doing that was because it affirms that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So at that point, we sort of knew we had to jump into action. Since that point, there's been a massive push across the country by CIJA and others, including B'nai B'rith Canada, kind of like a sister organization to the ADL, but arguably more right-wing, and some other groups that CIJA and B'nai B'rith have essentially lobbied to support this. And we've seen, so just sort of setting the scene in terms of what has happened, the federal government has adopted it as part of its anti-racism strategy, which of course is very unfortunate. Several municipal governments, including one just yesterday, mostly in sort of small suburban sub-cities where there are large Jewish conservative populations, but significant nonetheless. The Ontario provincial government, so the largest province in the country, has adopted it by a sort of decree. Quite recently, the government has appointed a special envoy, kind of like anti-Semitism czar, who's Erwin Kotler. Not just significant in Canada. He's a former Minister of Justice, but has been a big proponent of a sort of new anti-Semitism discourse, on the world stage, and seems to be quite active in the interparliamentary committee that's dealing with this, along with his daughter, who's a member of Knesset. And of course, there's been a push on universities, like elsewhere, to adopt it. Last sort of site of struggle is that there's an attempt to have it adopted as legal precedent in human rights cases. That's something we're following closely.
So I want to come back to you on a bunch of that. I want to shift to Barry for a moment. Barry, you've been studying and observing how anti-Semitism affects Jewish people and Jewish communities, both historically and in the present day. In 2017, as I said, you testified before Congress against the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act and the IHRA definition, and I want to quote you. You said that, quote, attempts to legislate speech that is perceived as anti-Semitic, and then ... while seemingly well-intentioned, are in fact efforts to suppress ongoing campus discussions regarding the state of Israel and its supporters. So to set the scene for us today, can you give us a quick overview of why you think that these efforts to legislate speech are in reality attempts to stifle discussion of Israel?
Sure. First, just let me say thank you for this opportunity to participate in the webinar. I'm really honored to be in conversation with you, Lara, and with Corey and Rebecca. So back when I gave that testimony, this, as you said in the introduction, was in the early stages of the efforts to pass the IHRA definition, codify it into law, and that was part of a multi-year effort to pass something called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in the United States. And although it was targeted towards educational institutions, generally speaking, so K through 12 plus higher ed, the questions really came down to questions of speech about Israel on campuses. And there was this this widespread rhetoric going on at the time, and several studies had come out from Zionist groups saying that anti-Semitism was skyrocketing across US campuses, when some other studies that weren't so, I think, partisan based were making it very clear that actually anti-Semitism was declining on US campuses, and the lived experience of many Jews on campus was one of increased acceptance, in that while they were made uncomfortable at times over conversations about Israel, they didn't feel that there were hindrances to themselves of living as Jews on campus and doing so openly. Some of that has, of course, changed with the right-wing assault on Jews coming from white supremacists under the Trump administration, but generally those trends seem to be true. What we see instead is that the IHRA definition has been used repeatedly in the last several years in ways to stop speech on campus that is critical of Israel. It stopped Palestinians from talking about it on campus. It stopped Jews from talking about it on campus. And I can give a few examples of this, one starting with my own university. So it was late 2018, the student government passed the IHRA definition against the advice of several student groups on campus. And in response, another group of students decided to host what they were calling the Palestinian Solidarity Week on campus, and they staged a number of events, all of which were interrupted by Zionist supremacist students, often with the backing of the administration. So what that meant was that a film Q&A following this screening of 5 broken cameras had to be canceled because of threats of disruption. It meant that a poster session that had been put up in the student union had to be qualified with other signage from the administration saying that students could give other points of view. There was sort of a whole range of things. And the highlight of this was a panel discussion which involved myself and other faculty members, and should have involved several students who were chased away and really given all sorts of threats from other students and intimidation by other faculty. And so their speech was suppressed, just trying to have a critical conversation about the IHRA definition. And what's happened at Wake Forest, unfortunately, has happened in many places around the country, at Rutgers, UC Berkeley, NYU, Georgetown, UCLA, my alma mater, University of North Carolina, Georgia Tech. There's been many places around the country where efforts to have critical conversations about Israel and Palestine are stopped in the name of the IHRA definition. What we haven't seen is that the IHRA definition has been used to go after white supremacists, right? I mean, this is really quite clear. A point I'll probably get back to at some point. You know, it's said that its design is to combat anti-Semitism, but the real threat, and this is where I've testified in Congress and many other, and sort of written about in other places, like the real threat to Jews is obviously coming from the right wing. Like this is where we see attacks on Jewish bodies, attacks on Jewish institutions are emerging. And this is no longer speculation. For as you wrote about quite a bit yesterday on Twitter, Lara, the Israeli government has announced its policy on this. And so 2 days ago, the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs announced its position paper where it talked about its very, very clear plan to combat what it considers to be anti-Semitic speech on social media. And its definition for anti-Semitic speech is based on the IHRA definition. And it completely conflates what we would all think of as legitimate criticism of Israel as a state actor with attacks on the Jewish people as a whole. So what was speculation in some ways and what we all just sort of assumed, we now know clearly is Israeli state policy.
Thanks. And I just want to add three things. One, Five Broken Cameras, the movie you're talking about that was stopped, is an Israeli film. It's an Israeli film about how the IDF treats Palestinians who are non-violently protesting occupation. So it's an Israeli film. On the attacks on academia, I think my colleague will put into the chat box the table. We actually have a table tracking this, and it's remarkable. Since President Trump's executive order on anti-Semitism, you have the IHRA definition basically being used as part of Title VI, and all of the cases are about criticism of Israel, not about white supremacists or Nazis or anything else. And then the third part I forgot. So Rebecca, I was going to mention the AMCA initiative because it's interesting. We were talking about it as a group before we went on this call. In 2020, this right wing Adam Milstein funded group did their report on campus anti-Semitism. And they have in one of their opening paragraphs that regular classical anti-Semitism dropped from 2019 to from the time period they're looking at, 2018, 2019, whatever it was, by like 49%, I think they said, or 45%. And then the rise is all on the criticism of Israel. And their conclusion is anti-Semitism is surging, when actually it's just the way they've defined it. So Rebecca, I want to shift to you. Again, I think everyone should be following Rebecca. I say that really, really enthusiastically. You have written extensively and you tweet extensively about racism inside the Jewish community in the US and efforts to, and I'm quoting, silence and discredit Jews of color who are pushing conversations on race and Israel past the point of comfort for some of our white peers, presenting our voices as extreme while using our racial otherness as a means of exclusion. Can you talk to us about how the discussion around anti-Semitism in the US reflects, in particular, the experiences of Jews of color?
Yeah, sorry. I think you'll find that when anti-Semitism is discussed a lot in the US, Jews of color are either left completely out of the conversation or we're instrumentalized in a way that associates our safety and existence with, the protection of the state of Israel. And I think, one of the aspects of the IHRA definition that I find the most sort of problematic is this example that, says that denying Jewish people their right to that says that denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, example, by claiming the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Conflating this idea of all Jewish people are protected if Israel is not allowed to be called a racist state is directly harmful to Jews of color, because if you read, a lot of our scholarship, if you follow our movement, there's incredible critique of not just Israel, but also the US and every other, country that we're found in about our experiences of race and racism. And so to define, Jewish self-determination's protection from a critique of racism is to write Jews of color completely out of the community. And it's also to sort of, I think, get ahead of systematic critique in general, which is a big part of our movements right now. Since the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, kicked off by the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there's been also a movement within the Jewish community for equality, inclusion, and better representation for Jews of color. And that a big part of that is a systematic critique of the US Jewish community along with the policies and politics of the United States, right? And there has been a lot of, work to better accept Jews of color, of course, in response to this movement, but there's also been a very harsh backlash from people to the right in the Jewish community. And that quote that you pulled from me, I think is from an article from a few years ago when my Jewish identity was first being sort of placed under attack in public because of my Black background. That has only gotten worse, actually, since I wrote that article. And we're seeing right now a very concerted effort to drive, Jewish voices like my own off social media. And it's interesting that, you've been telling folks to follow me on Twitter. That's also the #1 site of harassment that I get for my advocacy on these issues, specifically often from other Jews or else groups that are purporting to represent them. And this is like a systematic problem in terms of these, public forums where we're subjected to all kinds of abuse. And I think we'll have more opportunities to dive deeper into this, but a lot of the discussion also tends to pit movements like Black Lives Matter against the Jewish community. What the people doing this will fail to mention is that like some of the first people to even use that term Black Lives Matter were actually Jews of color. There are Jews of color very deeply embedded in that movement. There are Jews of color like as leaders in organizations like the Dream Defenders in Florida, which was created after the killing of Trayvon Martin and has done incredible work in terms of like reinstating Black voting rights in that state. So this idea that, for example, Black Lives Matter is inherently an anti-Semitic movement, which is very commonly stated among, proponents of the IHRA definition and other right-wing, pro-Israel Jewish groups, is also to sort of write us out of the movement and history of Black Lives Matter and who we conceive as Jewish people. And in the United States, Jews of color are something like 12% of the US Jewish community. We represent more of the US Jewish community than Jews represent of the American, demographics, right? So there's some very serious, inherently racialized elements to how this whole conversation unfolds that is specifically to the detriment of Jews of color. The only time we are allowed to exist in these conversations is if we are examples of how diverse Israel is. And that is another problem as well, because in addition to speaking out on US racial justice issues, I'm a journalist and a filmmaker. I work extensively with Jews of color in Israel. And this is not only in a Palestinian rights context. I'm often working with people who I really disagree with on that topic, but they are all lobbying, systemic critiques of the Israeli state, or like many of their movements are, whether you're talking about the Israeli Black Panther movement of Mizrahi Jews, or you're talking about, the current Ethiopian protest movement, or even most recently a case of the Ugandan Jews who are trying to immigrate to Israel, and the state refuses to acknowledge them as Jewish, even though many diaspora Jewish like religious movements do recognize them and do work with them. So there are like many issues to the racial element of how Jews are being discussed in this particular context.
Thanks. I think that's a great framing. I want to ask you to go deeper into this. Can you talk about how the struggle over the definition of anti-Semitism itself relates to the broader political context, and how the struggles over the definition and advocacy for Palestinians connect with anti-Black racism and other forms of oppression, both inside and outside of Jewish communities? And I say this for an audience, I think, who probably, like me, are very aware of Jews having, being called Jews in name only or whatever. But we see it, it only goes so far. there's a different, has a completely different flavor when it's aimed at Jews of color. I've watched this. It has been humbling over the past few years, realizing the broader implications of this. So can you dig deeper into that?
Yeah. So in terms of like how defining anti-Semitism is sort of like coming up in these like broader political contexts, one thing we're having right now in California is a struggle over ethnic studies. And there's been a lot of efforts to label, the ethnic studies movement in general, and including the specific curriculum that was being pushed in California as anti-Semitic, often using like these types of like the IHRA definition. And I think, one of the things that is very disturbing to me is you mentioned IHRA Initiative. I'm very familiar with this organization. It's been operating since I was a student activist at UC Santa Cruz. The school was under a Title VI investigation launched by this like initiative while I was a student there. And this Title VI case claimed to speak on behalf of Jewish students like myself, and said that the existence of pro-Palestinian groups, including many, left-wing Israeli organizations and events that were being held on campus, were a threat to Jewish students. That case was thrown out because it didn't have merit, and it wasn't even filed by a student. It was filed by actually my former Hebrew teacher who's involved in this organization. That created a lot of issues. But one of the things I found out during that period was this organization has released materials that blame modern anti-Semitism in the US. And in this case, they're really talking about Palestinian organizing, but they're labeling it modern anti-Semitism. They blamed it on the 1969 Black Studies strike at SF State. So they're blaming Black organizing and really the concept of ethnic studies for anti-Semitism. That makes it impossible for someone like me to really exist publicly in the Jewish community, or it's an effort to, because how can I talk about, for me, ethnic studies is a movement for Black history to be in Black hands, to be told by us, not from the perspective of, people who benefit from our systematic oppression. If that can't exist without, if that's being labeled anti-Semitic, how can me as a Black Jewish person exist in public? It's writing us out of the community, like I've been saying. And this extends far beyond this issue. Like I was mentioning, Black Lives Matter. During the Ferguson protests, there was direct solidarity between Black people and Palestinians. And I happen to have a personal relationship to this because my family's from St. Louis County, where Ferguson is. I was there when Michael Brown was killed for a family reunion. I remember the ways that, Palestine was on a lot of people's minds because there was an Israeli invasion of Gaza happening at the same time. So protesters were chanting Gaza Strip in the streets as they were being tear gassed by the Ferguson police. Palestinians offered their solidarity over Twitter, giving advice on how to deal with being tear gassed. Because of this, Palestine becomes part of the Black Lives Matter movement in that moment. And this is, part of historic relationships that go back as far as Black and Jewish historic relationships do in many cases. And the efforts by some in the Jewish community in the wake of that to portray Black Lives Matter as an anti-Semitic movement were incredibly harmful, especially for Jews of color who are standing in between these two communities. And the idea that fighting for my right to exist as a Black person in this country is the same thing as hating Jewish people is a way that this gets sort of used to pit two communities against each other to the exclusion of another community. And I think we see over and over again, and I can talk more about this later, that Black public figures who are speaking out for justice for Black people in this country, if you're also including Palestinian rights in that analysis, you're under constant threat. People lose jobs, people have accolades taken away, and their sort of legacies of organizing are discredited and ignored on the basis of they've spoken about Palestinian rights. And, this is just one of many examples of the ways that it's really impacting our entire political conversation to even have these definitions being centered the way that they are.
Thanks. I was thinking today, watching on Twitter and in the media, the response right now to a book that is coming out from Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plutnik. And, Mitchell is Jewish and is getting some flack. Mark is Black and is being attacked in, on his academic credentials, his views on Israel, anti-Semitism. And there's no engagement at all on the actual substance of the book. It's quite extraordinary. Trying to take it a step further for a Jewish American who is also Black, and that sense that there is no space at all in which you can operate, which you can authentically represent your viewpoint. It's kind of suffocating to even think about. Barry, I want to shift over to you. Let's talk about the momentum around the IHRA definition, which I know you are following very closely. You and I are in conversation about this. Why and how do you think has the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism come to be adopted by so many governmental and non-governmental bodies, including, ballet companies and football clubs, but also governments? And what roles are progressive Jews playing in that process in the US and even beyond, if you care to comment on the beyond?
Sure, I'd be happy to. If I could first, can I also just make a quick comment on something that Rebecca said regarding the really horrific assaults on ethnic studies programs in California? I think that those people who are launching those attacks in the name of somehow defending the Jewish people forget that Jewish studies is an ethnic studies program. And we need to really understand it that way. This is how I identify the program that I'm a part of and that I've sometimes been the leader of. And we have close associations with other ethnic studies programs. And in fact, the entire discipline of Jewish studies began really out of the same motivations that so many other ethnic studies programs emerged, as a way to assert the place of Jews within the academy and assert the place of Jews within the societies of which they're a part. It started a couple hundred years ago in Germany, but you can draw this very, very clear line, like this is where Jewish studies comes from too. So to somehow assume that Jewish studies can stand outside of those other sort of academic programs and is yet another exception to some sort of general rule, again, only reinforces this notion that the IHRA definition itself does, is that Jews are exceptional in the world and that we have to somehow box the way that we can talk about Jews in. And which, of course, the idea that Jews are exceptional is what underpins anti-Semitism to begin with. This idea that somehow Jews exist apart from the rest of the world, they're not of the worlds that they inhabit, and are constantly out to undermine those worlds. So these attacks on the ethnic studies programs that Rebecca was a part of as a student, it just means that people are just not paying attention to sort of their own past and their own history. But to get to your question, about the momentum of the definition, it seems like it came out of nowhere in some ways, but in fact, the IHRA definition, as your previous webinars have sort of gone over that history, right? It's a definition that's been around, since the early 2000s, and it began as a way to study anti-Semitism. If you look at it, it's not a very good definition, right? It talks about anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews and they then give a series of attributes. And then, of course, it's these examples. Because the definition itself wasn't very good, they then had to give all these examples to try to explain the definition that they had just proposed. Nevertheless, it's taken on all of this momentum. It started in the United States, if I recall correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, with the State Department, which adopted this definition very early on in the Trump administration. And that was the point at which the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act was first proposed. And all of the testimony that we gave back in 2017, was really talking about the way in which it's being misused by the State Department. And then, of course, it was adopted by the Department of Education, the Civil Rights Division, under Kenneth Marcus, who was one of the figures behind so many of the assaults on universities and academic programs. And then it has snowballed. And the reason why it's snowballed is because, as we now know, because of the concerted effort of so many Israeli-backed institutions, both now the government itself and then sort of all of its proxy organizations that exist as lobby groups, whether it's the lobby arm of the Federation of Canada or the ADL in the United States, and so many other groups, the American Jewish Congress, the World Jewish Congress, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, to really put forward this definition as if somehow it has any sort of real substance to it. And because people are always sort of willing to condemn anti-Semitism generally, the specter of the Holocaust looms so large, right? That's my field of studies, Holocaust studies, and I sort of understand that. That it becomes a very easy way to show that you're doing something sort of against anti-Semitism, against hatred, by backing this definition. But it obviously accomplishes very little to thwart anti-Semitism. And what we're seeing increasingly, that as these major Jewish organizations began increasingly sort of aligning themselves with the Trump administration, as he was taking moves to shift the embassy, right, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, to cut off funding to Palestinian human rights organizations, it allowed them to begin this conversation in order to further Israeli interests by passing this legislation, and effectively gave cover and sort of a pass to Trump's blatant white supremacy and anti-Semitism, of course. And so we see this definition, has really snowballed in this way. But what's been so impressive to me is the pushback against it by so many different quarters. And so if you look, for example, at the Facebook campaign that's going on right now. And so if you folks go to Facebook, we need to talk.org, they can sort of learn all about this campaign. And Facebook is one of these groups now that's being pressured enormously to adopt the IHRA definition in order to monitor speech around Zionists and sort of protect it as a category around which no critical speech can be held. Well, the campaign against it is this broad-based coalition of civil rights group, of constitutional rights group, of free speech groups, of Jewish organizations, Palestinian organizations, all sort of coming together to resist this. And hopefully we're going to have some impact, right? I've been part of conversations with Facebook that you're well aware of, Lara, that there are strong efforts. There's a great editorial in today's Guardian by the leader of Jewish Voice for Peace about the problems of this definition. And so hopefully, I think this is one of the campaigns that may have some real impact. And if we can perhaps stop it there at Facebook, we can then build upon that to get a better understanding of what anti-Semitism is and ways to talk about it appropriately that actually address the problems faced by Jews from actual anti-Semites.
Thanks. I do want to clarify the beginning of your answer. So
Sure.
the definition was actually adopted under the Obama administration. It was called something else at the time. The State Department adopted the same formulation with a different name. And the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act was actually stopped in Congress during that period. So the surge, but the real revving up is absolutely what you said. That's ancient history, it feels like, in many ways. I also am interested, I want to mention, because I think it dovetails with what you just said and with what Rebecca was commenting on. We mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of pushback coming from Jewish communal organizations from, the center and further left. And this week, I was struck by one of them, which came from a group called the Jewish, I don't remember the name of it. It's the Jewish Urban Council, something's in Chicago, who've done a lot of work across, the whole range of racial, social issues. And they specifically mention in their statement the work they've done with Black communities. And it clearly suggests that there's a problem here with the definition that's going to make it impossible to work across the actual issue of racism and discrimination and hate and just make Jews this unique case and separate from everything else. And that's really important. Corey,
yeah, we have other groups too. Like there's the reform movement itself of Judaism, I think, refused to adopt the definition. There's groups like Bend the Arc, right? So these groups that are not about countering Israeli aggression towards Palestinians, like that's not their mission, are coming out with the skepticism around this definition. So either opposing or just declining to take it on, or in some instances, taking on the definition, but not the examples.
And I'll add, I actually have a table tracking all of this on our website. One of my colleagues may throw that into the chat box. I have not updated it with today's article from Melissa, but every time there's a statement or a letter or something, I throw it in there. So there's at least one database that tries to keep track of all that. Corey, I want to turn to you. And I said earlier that one of the reasons I stay keenly aware of our neighbors up north is because you give me hope. I have watched IJV with a fair amount of awe in the efforts that you have had in recent years, sort of long before this started churning a pushback in the US. You were doing pushback in Canada with remarkable success. I want you to talk about that. How did that come about? How did progressive Jews in Canada achieve success? Talk about the No IHRA campaign. This is something I think we can all learn from, and that hopefully can impart some success to those of us working in the US.
Great, thanks, Lara. Okay, before I launch into why we're so great and all the great things we've done, thank you. Just a quick comment on the push and also the opposition. I think one thing that I think is important to highlight is that some of the statements are talking, and some of the pushes are around codification into law and regulation. Some of them are opposing it in principle, or just having it adopted in motions. I just want to stress that it doesn't have to be codified into law or regulation to have an impact and to be even referenced by politicians or courts, etc. Of course, it's strengthened if codified, but it's not innocent if it's non-binding. Because
I think there, just to add, if you look at the document that the government of Israel released yesterday to Facebook, what they're actually now saying is, well, fine, we don't want to quash free speech necessarily, so you can use the IHRA definition to just put a label on things that violate the IHRA definition and label them as anti-Semitism. That doesn't require codifying into law or anything, and you can see the chilling effect that will have very clearly.
Exactly, because we've seen a lot of people say, I can see the problems with this regarding free speech, etc., but because it's non-binding, it's okay. I think the big project here is a discourse shift and labeling, institutionalizing this idea of new anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, right? So, we can come back to that. Okay, IJV, essentially for people that aren't familiar with us, is kind of like JVP in Canada. We're an activist campaigning organization. We do, we work with other movement organizations. We work in solidarity directly with Palestinians. We also engage in some government advocacy work and have chapters across the country. So in June of 2019, we launched our No IHRA campaign. That was right before the government unfortunately adopted it. So that was a big defeat up front. But after that, we did start having some significant success when it popped up around the country, especially in municipalities. Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal have all sort of did not adopt it after campaigns in those cities to oppose it, which IJV played central roles in. There's also a city that adopted it and then backtracked and excised the examples because they realized that there were problems there. The most high-profile one was definitely the Ontario legislature, which had a law to adopt it, which is rather rare, actually, to have laws rather than sort of motions. And there were going to be public hearings, and there were like hundreds of people and organizations lined up, and they shut down the public hearings the day before and adopted it by sort of decree. And very interesting. In the end, it was a sort of partial win for us because it wasn't actually a law in the end. It's sort of an executive order, but it doesn't have the same powers as law. And also the examples aren't explicitly mentioned now. Whether or not they're going to use them is up for debate. Why are we having success? I mean, I think there might be a few factors. We have this No IHRA campaign. Thanks for posting that, or No IHRA website, the sort of resource hub. I think when we jumped on this, there were already people that were working on this, especially in the UK, but there was there weren't many resources yet. So we did a lot of sort of groundwork. The first thing we launched was a report that broke down the definition sort of word by word, line by line, critiquing it. We have video, we're keeping track of a list of incidents where it's used to censor or attack people that are generally supporting Palestinian rights and are more than likely people of color. And so, tons there. We also have our own definition of anti-Semitism that we're promoting. So I encourage people to check that out. Another factor that was especially significant in Ontario was really building an alliance. We've had a lot of success with labor unions, with academics, Palestinian, Muslim, Arab community organizations who often don't live in, who might live in suburbs and might otherwise vote conservative, and therefore, their vote matters, for example, in a place like Ontario. I think that was very significant. So, we're trying to come at this from different angles because we know it also impacts, this is not just a conversation. I think in the beginning, it was really a conversation amongst Jews, but this is something that impacts, Palestinians, people. There have been so many cases where people are, attacked in extremely Islamophobic ways, for example, when they're accused of so-called anti-Semitism based on the IHRA definition. And I suppose the last thing is just making noise, making this a public conversation. We found where we don't hear about, there was just some, it was just adopted in a small city outside of Montreal. We didn't know about it. But generally when we know about it and it becomes a public conversation, it's much more difficult for this to pass because it's evident for the public that there are major problems with this.
So sticking with you, in the introduction, and we've commented a little bit throughout about the growing, debate within the Jewish community in the United States around IHRA. We are actually having pushback from Jewish groups, and most particularly, obviously, we have JVP, but Americans for Peace Now, and J Street, and Trua, and Ben the Ark, and New Israel Fund. Really coming out. Some of this because they were forced. The Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations sought to sort of force a universal acceptance from at least member organizations, which really compelled people to get on the record. But also because I think this issue is really coming to a head here. Are you seeing anything similar in Canada within the Jewish community? And if so, what does that look like? And if not, why not?
Right. Okay. Thanks. So a lot of this has been mentioned, but it's been super encouraging to watch this unfold and to watch all the Jewish organizations, especially in the US, come out against it. I wrote a sort of listicle in the beginning of December where I tried to compile as many statements as I could, and different people and Jewish studies professors and organizations that were coming out against it. Just since that time, it's 2 months. The list has expanded dramatically. So that's been really, really great. And a lot of the organizations that have come out against it have already been mentioned. And also just to amplify what both Barry and Lara are saying is it really seems like the community is being split, like there's a shift to the sands, or whereas JVP and IJP were very much outside, beyond red lines, for example, not long ago. We're seeing a sort of expansion, I think, and the community being divided around the IHRA definition, which is encouraging because we're much stronger, of course, that way, where we have some of the liberal Zionist groups, et cetera, that are supporting. I assume Peter Baynard, who you have, of course, very involved with FMEP, plays a role in that sort of move as well from many people in the sort of progressive liberal Zionist world. B'Tselem's apartheid report probably plays a role too, but I think IHRA might be the most significant in terms of a shift from my perspective. And of course, I'm commenting from the outside in Canada on the American context. You asked about the Canadian context. Of course, the Canadian community is much more conservative. It's also much more centralized. CJA really tried to tries to be everything for everyone in many ways. And then B'nai B'rith is sort of far to the right. There are some liberal Zionist groups, most of whom have decidedly stayed out of this conversation. Very encouraging, however, New Israel Fund of Canada has come out against it. They initially supported it. They supported actually being adopted in law in Ontario, which was unfortunate, but they have now taken a step back and followed their American cousins. So that's really good. JSpace, we have something called JSpace Canada, which is kind of like J Street. They are supporting it. And though they have expressed some sort of caution. And then, Canadian Friends of Peace Now is another actor. They haven't taken a position on it. So I'm hoping with all the moves in the US that the Canadian organizations will finally take a position on this. I think many of them may want to just focus on, the work that they're doing, talking about settlements, et cetera. What I've been telling people is that, of course, that's really, really important, and we need to continue that sort of offensive work. But this IHRA definition, all of that is distorting all of that work and making it impossible for us to have any sort of success on those fronts. So it's vital that we take stances against this. One other thing about Canada, we've done some polling of Canadians and Canadian Jews, and I don't think I sent the link, but we found that something like half of Canadian Jews agreed that anti-Semitism is often used to silence criticism of Israel. So that, to some extent, gives me hope that there are more critical Jews out there in the Canadian landscape. They might not be represented by organizations, but they're out there.
Thanks. That's great. I want to shift back to Barry. So, from the perspective of a scholar of Jewish history, you have, I assume, views on the conflation of criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. You've already talked about this, that conflation that we're seeing in IHRA, and we've seen for years. This is not a new thing. But specifically, one of the examples in the IHRA definition talks about denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination and denying Israel's right to exist, and calling that in itself anti-Semitism. And you argue against that in your congressional testimony, but I want you to unpack that again for us here. How you as a progressive Jew and as a scholar relate to the concept that Israel is an expression of Jewish self-determination in and of itself. And this question touches on this common refrain amongst defenders of the IHRA definition, and first and foremost Jews, that anti-Zionism is itself anti-Semitism. This is a definitional truth that cannot be challenged. And how do you see that? How do you take that apart, and how do you respond to it?
Yeah, I think the first piece, though, is we have to talk about the Jewish people, right? Certainly, as Rebecca has talked about in one context and Corey in another, there's not one Jewish people, right? There are Jews in the world. There are people who define themselves as Jews, who are also identified as Jews, but often share very little in common with one another, right? I mean, so as Rebecca's talked about, right? So Jews in Uganda are not recognized by the state of Israel as Jew because somehow religiously they don't fit some definition that is in play at the moment. I wrote a piece last year for Mondoweiss talking about the new excommunication, right? The new cherem, where this definition, the saying that Zionism is Judaism, has now sort of been flipped on its head. And so that anti-Zionism is now somehow heresy. And so if you put forward any criticisms of Israel or even attack its founding principles in some way, you're really becoming excommunicator. There's efforts to excommunicate us, me, you, from the Jewish community, right? But there is no one Jewish community. There are many, many Jewish communities, and there's really no organization nor state that can represent all of us and the entire civilization of Jews. The other piece, though, that you're really asking about, I think, is self-determination, right? And so the idea of Jewish self-determination, you know, is kind of an old concept, and they're not using that language. I'm not sure when that actual expression kind of comes into play, but the idea that Jews represent a nation who have the right to sort of chart their own history and destiny in the world is an idea that comes out really of the late 19th, early 20th century, when Jews, after about 100 years or so in Europe, after of trying to locate a space for themselves within these European societies, begin sort of realizing that these new forms of anti-Semitism that are based in race and which are becoming dominant in the world are just denying them those possibilities. And so there's all sorts of conversation. This is really what I spend a lot of time researching and writing about in my academic work. And there's all these variants of Jewish nationalism that emerge. Most of them are insisting on the rights of Jews to live in the lands where they are already present, to live fully as Jews, to speak in Jewish languages, to organize their own societies, to have the right to petition the government in their own languages, to teach kids in their own schools, because they're experiencing this constant rejection. Although they're doing sort of everything that's been told to them, they're still not being welcomed in these societies as Jews, right? We can point to the Dreyfus Affair in France. We can point to other sort of anti-Semitic scandals at this time period. One of those movements, of course, is the Zionist movement that comes out, and this is a minority movement. And what it argues is that there's no place for Jews in Europe, and that Jews need to move to a land of their own. And this is the moment at which the movement for Jewish self-determination turns from being a movement of resistance to one of colonialism and settlement, because of course there's no place in the world that's unoccupied, right? And there are all sorts of ideas bandied about, including Uganda, as it turns out, right? This is one of the ideas that Herzl himself was putting forward, places in the world where Jews should settle. But of course, it was then Palestine, or the land of Israel, which is the one that the movement rallied around. And from the very beginnings of that movement, there are efforts to displace the indigenous Palestinian community. And you can see it in the writings of Herzl, in his own diary writings, in speeches of Zionist leaders. And they're trying to push out Arabs because they bring with them the racist and colonialist ideas that are present within European society. And they bring that with them into their practice of settlement and colonization in the name of Zionism, in the name of Jewish self-determination. What's so interesting, though, is this idea that somehow criticizing Israel as a racist endeavor is problematic. It's just so fascinating because, right, we're living in a moment where we're having those same questions about the United States, right? And we think of the 1619 Project, right, and how, you know, historians and many schools, both public and at the higher education level, are recognizing that the real founding of the United States was in the practice of slavery, and how racism is sort of imbued through and through American society. It's like we can have those conversations, and there's pushback against them, and there's debates against them, but there's no one saying you can't talk about it here in the United States. But why can't we have a 1948 project where we talk about what happened with Israel's founding? Like, the idea that we would even raise that conversation is now being marked as anti-Semitic, right? That we can never even have the conversation of talking about the founding of Israel as an inherently racist project. We can talk about it for the United States. We can talk about that with Canada as well, but somehow we can't talk about that with Israel, right? That's, again, goes back to this idea that Jews are an exceptional people, about whom we can only speak in sort of the most praiseworthy terms. And I got to say, as a Jew, you know, I find this so disconcerting, right? Because what that means is we can't engage in what is the most sort of necessary practice for any sort of group of people who want to kind of keep moving forward, and that's that of self-criticism, right? Self-examination, where we have to be able to interrogate our own histories, interrogate our own practices, in order to sort of move forward and to create a society that's based upon universal principles of justice and freedom and equality. So,
thank you. That's a lot to chew on. I want to come back to you in a minute, but first I want to go to Rebecca. Rebecca, there is an ecosystem of right-wing organizations out there, led and funded by Jewish Americans, that seek to impose consequences for what they see as anti-Semitism. In many cases, their greatest focus in their alleged fight to root anti-Semitism seems to be supporters and advocates for Palestinian rights, and there they seem to disproportionately target people of color, and particularly women of color, like Representative Elhan Omar, Representative Rashida Tlaib, and Linda Sarsour. And they also target Jews and Jews of color. And one of these groups, stopantisemitism.org, which a lot of folks probably know about, recently targeted you for your support of Palestinian rights on social media. And I think this is a difficult question to ask you to talk about because this is personal, but I'd like you to talk about that campaign and the dynamics it exposed. It was very, very, very painful to watch.
Yeah, so first of all, you are right that there is an ecosystem. This isn't about just one organization. This is about a whole network of organizations. And before I get into this particular organization's particular incident, I just want to say this has been going on for years prior to the existence of this group. There are websites like Canary Mission, which, which catalogs and tracks students, mostly students of color, mostly Palestinians, but also many Black and brown, and in some cases also like European Jewish students, finds quotes from them and puts them on these dossiers that are meant to prevent them from being employed in the future. So there's a very specific targeting of vulnerable students to punish them for speaking out on Palestinian rights that existed before this website. This particular website, Stop Antisemitism, sort of takes these same tactics to a more extreme level in terms of its targeting. And I'm featured on both of these websites, by the way. Stop Antisemitism sort of tries to gamify this mentality of punishing people for their political views. For example, they have people who they'll name the anti-Semite of the week, and then they'll have a contest every year where they or not contest, but like a poll every year where they have people vote on who's the anti-Semite of the year, and they actually give out prizes for participating in that, to try and encourage people. Like this year, I think they were offering like gift card raffle or something in this process. And I was targeted by this website in December. And it was because I've been speaking out on a number of issues online about, racism towards Palestinians. I'd recently published an article that was critical of some of the discourse in the US around like, when are people able to, compare Trump policy to like Nazi fascism and these kinds of things. And so I was getting sort of a lot of heat and attention for like this conversation. And their Twitter page targeted me, commenting on my background as a patrilineal Jew. I pointed this out and said it was racist, and the next week I was deemed the anti-Semite of the week. It was direct retaliation for me responding to their racist harassment of me. What happened over, when I was deemed this, is they put up this little profile of me, and I have it in front of me right now. Prefer folks to not look it up because it's just very racist, and it hurts me to even have to like look at this. But yeah, they claim that I invented being Jewish in college when I joined SJP. I shouldn't have to say this, no other panelist has to say this, but that's a lie. You can find very easily, I'm 9 years old participating in Jewish community events that are written about in my local Jewish newspaper. It's totally false and defamatory, but it doesn't matter. There's nothing stopping them. They zoom in, much like Canary Mission, on my criticisms of white supremacy in Israel and in the US Jewish community. This is a direct effort to, like the IHRA definition does, to make talking about racism considered anti-Semitic. So this is not, it's anti-racist, right? It's racism. That's the bottom line of all of this. And they also point out that I've been talking about solidarity between Jews of color and Palestinians. I'm far from the first person to do this. There's been stuff going back to the 50s where Mizrahi Jews in Israel were like forming relationships with Palestinians, including in places like Wadi Salib and Haifa, and in the Mabarot and like this kind of stuff. So there's an attempt to like delegitimize the entirety of like Jews of color and are organizing through this sort of targeting. And then they also link to my Twitter profile and tell people to report it. I was actually suspended from Twitter while I was receiving all of this harassment from them. And I had to like work with actual like human rights organizations to get that reversed. And what these groups did was they reported a selfie that I had taken of myself, falsely using Twitter privacy rules to claim that I was somehow violating that. And in the aftermath of this, I was subjected to incredible harassment because they linked to my social media profiles. I received messages from Christian Zionists telling me that I'm a part of the Synagogue of Satan, which is like explicitly anti-Semitic harassment. I received messages about the shape of my nose, which was either a reference to me being an ugly Jew or Black. Comments about my lips, my other facial features, and like this is nakedly racial harassment. There's no way of arguing that this isn't. The next week, the same website did the same thing to a high school student who was a Black Jewish girl, talking about white supremacy in our community. So there's like a direct link between, like I've been saying, this campaign to like sort of punish anti-Semitism and define it as being criticism of Israel, criticism of racism in Israel, and just the driving of Jews of color out of our public spaces. I know a number of young Jews of color who are like no longer on social media after that 1 month of just harassment that was happening. And I think that we have to really recognize that these right-wing forces in our community, and we know that this website is supported by like Adam Milstein, a Trump supporter, these right-wing forces in our community are driving out Jews of color, leftist Jews, and anyone who's really critical of their, frankly, extremist point of view. And I think we need to really name that this is not a moderate position to say that you can't talk about racism in the Jewish community. It's not a moderate position to say that Black Lives Matter is inherently a hateful or anti-white group, as some of the people who like support these initiatives have done, including like Mort Klein, head of the ZOA, right? That these same groups are attacking interfaith families. They're attacking people who have converted to Judaism. Many of the targets, the Jews of color who have been targeted in these campaigns, are Gerim converts, or like me, from interfaith families. And that's been kind of inseparable in a lot of this. So we have to really look at this as not only, and it's an issue of free speech for Palestinians and on Palestinian rights, but it's also an issue of like, what kind of Jewish community do we want to be? Do we want to be a Jewish community where diversity is valued, where difference of opinion is valued, where we can debate and argue and do these things that we've done for thousands of years? Or do we want a community that is completely, within a box, completely fitting into an idea of Judaism that really just serves, power in this sense? Like, who is like the structures of power that are in place in the United States, the structures of power that are in place around the world that disenfranchise people like me, and frankly have disenfranchised Jews for the entirety of our history.
That's such a powerful description of what's happening, and I think just it underscores the fact that this isn't happening by accident. It's not happening because there's good intentions that have gone awry. The intention here is bad. And it's sort of like the intention is bad, and everything that flows from it, even if people say, listen, we really care about anti-Semitism, this is what you're doing. And if your intention is about anti-Semitism, this wouldn't be happening. This is about already exploiting anti-Semitism for a different goal. And it makes, it is not a surprise. It shouldn't surprise anyone that this is what happens, because the intentions behind it are bad. I want to stick with you, Rebecca. Can you talk about the lessons you draw from your experiences with this campaign targeting you? And here I'm trying to flip it to a slightly more like, look ahead, positive. Talk about what you see as opportunities for Jewish activists and organizations in this moment, as there's more of a spotlight on what's happening, more awareness, and opportunities to be actively anti-racist, because I think it's really important the way you framed this. This isn't by accident, this isn't casual, this is racism. And it isn't enough to not be engaging in it. You have to be actually opposing it. The opposite of racist is not I'm not a racist, it's I'm anti-racist, right? We've learned this. And what does it mean to advocate for Palestinian rights in this context? And opportunities also to defend the space for that advocacy and make way for what Corey mentioned, which is confronting real anti-Semitism, which really should be, worrying all of us if we're paying attention.
Well, these efforts to sort of, silence and drive specifically Jews of color out of the community are very concerning to me for, the reasons I just laid out, but also because Jews of color are actually in a very unique position in terms of like increasing conversations between the Jewish community and the communities that we're a part of outside of it. A really clear example of this that benefited Jewish people that is not, commonly discussed is in the aftermath of the Women's March controversy over Farrakhan, where like Tamika Mallory, who was a member of the board, was like, in trouble for past comments praising Farrakhan and participating in an NOI event, Nation of Islam events. What happened in the aftermath of that was Jewish women of color made an intervention that was not highlighted by many of the groups who have been sort of pushing the Women's March conversation and the narrative that the Women's March is anti-Semitic. But they addressed Tamika Mallory individually and privately, and she ends up going on a very popular Black program called the Breakfast Club and addressing anti-Semitism and really talking to a Black audience about why anti-Semitism is so harmful. That really doesn't get discussed, and that was done through the work of Jews of color. That same year, Jewish women of color marching becomes a prominent part of the Women's March, where like anti-Semitism was actually being highlighted in a new way as part of a racial justice struggle because of this work. So efforts to sort of like present conversations about race and racism in the Jewish community as anti-Semitic actually directly harm these struggles against anti-Semitism, because more often than not, I'm better positioned to, for example, get Black folks to think critically about Farrakhan than a white Jewish person making a demand is, because I know the dynamics. I'm able to like wade through the messy parts of like that relationship because I'm part of the Black community. So if you want to talk about fighting anti-Semitism, and specifically fighting on anti-Semitism on the left, which a lot of these initiatives are claiming to do, you actually need people on the left, and you need people in left movements who have an investment of that, including Jews of color, in order to push these conversations in a way that is actually healthy, that actually addresses this, rather than simply pitting Jews against, you know, Black Lives Matter or racial justice movements. If that's really your goal, you should not be silencing a voice like mine. I actually give talks on anti-Semitism in the Black community. I don't make that super public because it's for specific, I mean, I'm open about it, but like that's for specific communities to address issues. It's not always the most front-facing thing, but our work isn't always front-facing. It's based in relationships. And I think that's really what we have to remember, is that the IHRA definition in many ways, like, you know, I think Barry was saying, sort of singles out Jews from other struggles. It makes us different, and marks us as different in this other kind of way that, you know, the prejudice that we experience somehow cannot be like understood in the same mechanisms that we use to understand other forms of oppression, when actually we're much stronger side by side in forming relationships and not relying on states to define that for us, but doing it in our communities where we're able to find these connections. And that work is very hard and it's messy, and you're gonna run into people who you disagree with, and you're gonna run into ideas that challenge you. But if our response to that is to shut it down rather than to like have a discussion, we're not gonna get in any traction, and if anything, we're just going to further isolate ourselves into this bubble that is like already excluding people within our communities. So yeah.
Thank you. That's very, very well said. Barry, I want to come back to you. Definitions of anti-Semitism. Do we need one?
Yeah.
I mean, is it necessary to have a universal, which is the language that I keep seeing in the right-wing press now when they describe the IHRA definition? Do we need a universal definition? Do we need an updated definition because of some kind of realities that have changed that need to be updated? Is that necessary if we're fighting anti-Semitism, to have this absolute consensus and single term? And assuming that there is going to be one, however you answer that question, assuming there's going to have to be something that's relatively consensus, does it have to be the IHRA definition? Is that where it lands? Or is there something better that could be out there that would actually do a better job in this moment when progressives are talking about, you know, white supremacy and the connection between races and anti-Semitism, to actually allow the fight against anti-Semitism to be properly situated within the fights against other forms of hatred, racism, xenophobia, anti-religion, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So I've been deeply skeptical for a long time about the need for some hard and fast definition of anti-Semitism, for reasons you just said and reasons for Rebecca just said. Well, first of all, the idea of a universal definition of anti-Semitism, right, is trying to put forward a universal definition over one particular manifestation of history. So there's already kind of this internal contradiction there, right? So that's how are you going to have a universal definition that's going to apply to all instances, but only apply to the Jewish people? And as Rebecca just intimated, you know, the dangers of having some sort of hard and fast definition that everyone needs to follow are so great. You know, I have language on all of my syllabi about appropriate speech in the classroom, right? And then we talk about how, you know, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, racist, transphobic speech is not permitted. But I also qualify that and I say intentionally, you know, a speech that's intentionally in this way, because we have to allow our students who are just learning about these questions for the first time to be able to stumble, right? This is that messiness, I think, in some ways that Rebecca was just talking about, that as we start forming these coalitions and having these discussions, right? This is a process, and people have to be allowed to speak. They have to be allowed to sort of trip up. They have to be allowed to allow their understanding of these concepts to change and grow. And I have to have that freedom as well, right? So I'm very wary of definitions that seek to sort of lock in what we can say and what we can't say. I'm also afraid of what I've mentioned before, this idea that we're going to exceptionalize what can be said about Jews, right? And what does that mean to speak about Jews in this exceptional way? And you know, the long history of anti-Jewish hatred is really underpinned by this notion that Jews are incommensurate with the societies in which they reside, right? That we were marked as out to undermine Christianity, and then marked as out to undermine the European empires, and marked as out to undermine white society, and so on, all throughout our history. And so do we want to really reinforce notions of Jewish exceptionalism? So all that said, right, it's clear that where we are now, organizations and governments are clamoring for a definition. And it may be that the answer is to try to put forward a better one that's actually informed by the principles of universal equality that do exactly what Rebecca had said, is to look at anti-Semitism in the larger context in which it occurs, how it exists in relationship to anti-Semitism, to classism, to ableism, to all these other forms of prejudice. And when we start looking at it in that context, it can perhaps guide us towards a better understanding, if not at least a definition of it. You know, as I said in the testimony, and I'm trying to remember, I don't remember my exact words, it was just part of the back and forth. You know, any definition that goes beyond anti-Semitism is hatred against Jews for being Jews, then has to go and talk about context, right? What's the context in which it appears? And we had some very good models. I really like the IVJ definition. I think that you know, IJV. I'm sorry, IJV the working definition of anti-Semitism. I also like the definition from Jewish Voice for Labor. I think they're both very good because they place anti-Semitism within this larger context, and they see it as a project and as an ideology that's shaped by racism, it's shaped by xenophobia, it's shaped by anti-religious bigotry. And they insist on context, right? You have to be able to understand the context in which the statements are coming and who's making them, right? If it's is it anti-Semitism for a supporter of Israel to call me a capo, as you know, which happens from time to time, right? That's calling me a Nazi, basically, right? Saying I'm a collaborator with the Nazis. Well, under the IHRA definition, that would actually be not permitted, presumably, but I don't think that's what they're intending, right? They want to be able to call other Jews capos, but they don't want Israeli actions against Palestinians to be compared with the Nazis, right? So this is where we get into all the complexities of it. Ultimately, I think we do need to have some sort of definition, if only to be able to show that there is ones that can be countered to the IHRA definition. But I think I'll always still kind of hold on to a measure of skepticism.
Thanks. And I'll point out, under the IHRA definition, it is not considered anti-Semitic to call you or me a capo, but it is considered anti-Semitic to compare Israel's policies, the policies of a government, not even people. That would be anti-Semitic. It's quite striking. So Corey, I want to come back to you. And this has actually come up also in the Q&A box. Talk about, and I'm asking you your analysis, the rise in the efforts around the IHRA definition and how they dovetail or don't with efforts to fight activism in support of the Palestinians and particular BDS. For me, these seem inextricably linked, and I'd be interested in your analysis.
Thanks, Lara. I mean, I think we all sort of acknowledge that the use of the IHRA definition, the weaponization of the IHRA definition is to quash Palestine solidarity, especially the BDS movement, right? So, I mean, what's the response? I think there are two pieces here. One is that, you know, of course, when it's evident, of course, part of the power of the IHRA definition is its vagueness. It doesn't say BDS, it doesn't say anti-Zionism, right? But of course, that's how it's mobilized and interpreted. But regardless, I think when you try to sort of ban a discourse, a lot of people get their backs up and will say, okay, well, actually, I want to learn about this. And, you know, why are they trying to ban this nonviolent protest movement? So I think, you know, part of our role is not just to constantly be on the defensive, fighting for the very little space that we have to talk about these issues, I'm going to try to actually use this as an opportunity to go on the offensive, to do the work that we're doing, to talk about the issues that we're raising. You know, for example, we decided to do something a little cheeky, and we published 11 examples of how Israel is actually a racist endeavor in many ways. Of course, we could say that about the US and Canada and many other countries as well. And, you know, that's been circulating quite a bit on social media, and it's on our No IHRA website as well. There you go. You know, so using this as an opportunity to go on the offensive and to talk about the importance of BDS, to talk about how racism exists. I mean, link it also with B'Tselem calling Israel an apartheid state, right? So, yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do, and to sort of not get too caught up in the defensive. But it's crucial, and I echo very much what Barry and Rebecca were saying about the importance of working together, also about using this as an opportunity to fight against real anti-Semitism. And just real quickly, you know, we've been doing trainings also with allies about anti-Semitism, people saying, you know, we want to be able to, you know, fight for Palestinian rights and not be called anti-Semitic. It's probably impossible today, unfortunately. But, you know, people also want to, you know, it's not a contradiction in terms to support Palestinian liberation and be committed to fighting anti-Semitism. And that's something we really need to nail home.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end. I want to come back to Rebecca for something I have been thinking about a lot for the past few years, which is the issue of anti-Semitism being used in progressive politics to pressure or as a weapon against Black candidates. And I really started paying attention to this in the midterm elections a few years back, where we saw the battle against Stacey Abrams in the primary, where she was up against another progressive Democrat member. They're both House members. Her opponent was Jewish. And effectively, the single issue that was used in that primary to try to distinguish between the two was the fact that Stacey Abrams had voted against a bill that is basically trying to use anti-Semitism to quash free speech, and it's anti-BDS, which is anti-free speech. And she ended up posting on Medium just before the election this, you know, is passionate statement of support for Israel and how not to worry. That didn't mean she didn't support Israel. We saw it with Andrew Gillum in Florida with support for Dream Defenders used against him. We saw it in multiple places. And then, of course, it played a huge role in this past election in Georgia. Can you talk about how you see that and how you see the peril for progressives letting this become an issue that takes over the discourse internally, and also the opportunity to understand better what's going on and push back against it?
Yeah, well, what, you know, like you mentioned in the Georgia runoff election, this was a huge issue where Republican incumbent Kelly Loeffler was accusing Raphael Warnock, who is, you know, a Black activist, a senior pastor at Martin Luther King's Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. She was accusing of anti-Semitism for past statements critical of Israeli military violence against Palestinians during one of his sermons, and also for signing on to a letter of clergy who had traveled to Israel and Palestine. This was a group of Black American and Black South African clergy who, in the course of that, compared Israeli occupation of the West Bank to the South African occupation of Namibia during the apartheid era, which, by the way, was not actually a direct reference to apartheid, but this particular occupation, a military occupation by South Africa. And there were several very concerning things about the way this played out. One of them is, if we're talking about anti-Semitism, Kelly Loeffler's, you know, allied herself with QAnon supporters, with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, in some cases with people who have denied or minimized the Holocaust in the past throughout her campaign, because, you know, she's a right-wing Trump supporter, and this is a part of her base, are white nationalists who are anti-Semitic. So as she's accusing Raphael Warnock of anti-Semitism for supporting Palestinian rights, she herself is covering her tracks as an anti-Semite, as an avowed right-wing anti-Semite, right? Or someone who, at least at the very least, doesn't have a problem associating with them, which for me is a serious problem. But because she's supportive of the Israeli government, she's able to get an out from that. by accusing her opponent of not being pro-Israel enough or of being anti-Semitic. So that's actually a way that this type of conversation is clouding our ability to even address anti-Semitism when it's coming from the right. And by the way, the right wing is, far right extremists have killed Jews in our very recent memory. This isn't a theoretical problem. This is one that affects my safety going to synagogue, right? At the same time, it's about, sort of trying to present, this is in the context of her trying to present Raphael Warnock as extreme, and not only extreme because he's, signed statements in support of Palestinian rights, but extreme because he supports Black Lives Matter, right? That was she actually said he supports the anti-Zionist Black Lives Matter movement, and using anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism sort of interchangeably. And, similar to Stacey Abrams, Warnock really walked back his support for Palestinian rights, explicitly supported US military aid to Israel, and has made it clear that that's going to be part of his, policy going forward since he won that election. And this is really a problem for many issues, because I really don't know what the outcome of the Georgia election would have been had he not done that. But the fact that that's the politically expedient choice that you sort of have to make is not only walking back support of Palestinian rights, but supporting the Israeli government, regardless of what its policies are. That's a very big issue. And also, I just want to point out what Palestinian and Black organizers have shared over time are historic relationships that go back to the Black Power era, that go back to prisoner rights movements in both communities. And there's been in the same way that Black and Jewish people have relationships that have cross-pollinated each other's movements and understanding and struggle, so have Black and Palestinian people. So like asking us to divest ourselves from any support of Palestinian rights is also sort of asking us to distance ourselves from a very important part of Black organizing. And the history of Black organizing in the South involves boycotts. And so it's very interesting that when we see anti-BDS laws, they're being supported also by organizations and lobbying groups like ALEC that are going after water protectors, going after Black Lives Matter, protesters' rights, trying to pass these very draconian laws that prevent people from protesting our own government here in the United States, that also infringe on our First Amendment rights. So that you can't really disconnect the sort of targeting of Black political candidates and community organizers for Palestine solidarity from like an overall, anti-liberal sort of movement to silence, these social struggles. And it's very concerning. And like I was saying earlier, it's part of this sort of like cover for right-wing anti-Semites as well. It's very, very dangerous territory. And what concerns me is this idea that if you want to be involved in politics in the United States, as a Black person, you have to have a particular stance on Israel because you will be attacked in a way that white people might not necessarily. If you look at like Ilhan Omar, one of the first people to sort of accuse her of anti-Semitism was Kevin McCarthy, who has also himself been involved in right-wing anti-Semitism. And this kind of stuff that really got, he spreads George Soros conspiracy theories, the same conspiracy theories espoused by the Tree of Life shooter. Right. So it's an incredibly dangerous situation for everyone, Jews and Black people, when this becomes, a go-to tool. And I think on the left and Democrats, specifically like people in the center left, we need to do a better job of standing up when this happens, because it's a threat to really everything we're claiming to stand for in this moment or stand against when we're opposing white nationalism.
Thank you. I think that is a really powerful place to stop. We timed that well. So on behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank Corey, Rebecca, and Barry. Thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. For our audience, thank you so much for participating, and thank you for your questions. Whether or not your question got answered live, we will be giving a written report with all of the questions to the panelists, so they will have those to inform their own thinking and writing and speaking as they go forward. They know what you're interested in that way. Check back on our website, www.fmep.org, or on Facebook. We'll have a video of this event, and on the webpage, we'll have links to all the articles that we posted. So if you missed anything, you can find us there. Also, follow our panelists on Twitter. Those have been put into the chat box, and you can also find them on our website. And then also check our website for the next edition in our ongoing series on IHRA. Next week, it'll be all Palestinian viewpoints. So with that, we will let you go. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
And until the next time.
Thank you.
Pleasure.